I'm Dr. Deepak Chopra, and you're watching us now at the Chopra Center, my office at the Chopra Center. And I have the good fortune of having a visit today by Dr. Diane Powell, who's a psychiatrist. And she's an MD, she's a neuropsychiatrist. She practices in Oregon. Thanks for coming by.
Oh, thank you.
And so, where in Oregon is your practice?
It's outside of Ashland, southern Oregon.
It's outside of Ashland. And for many years, Dr. Powell, as I mentioned, she's a neuropsychiatrist, MD, physician. For many years, she's been interested in studying the savant abilities of autistic children. And these are really abilities that go beyond the normal range of human experience. So, Dan, tell me first of all, how did you get interested in this?
I started out as an undergraduate as a neuroscience major, and then went into medicine because I was really interested in human consciousness, which is why I became a psychiatrist. And I was wanting to understand, what's the relationship between the brain and consciousness. And with my background in neuroscience, I was looking at these clinical syndromes like savant syndrome, and I was asking myself, how could this be possible? It just didn't fit what neuroscience's model was for memory or for where we access information from. So just to let the audience know a little bit about a savant skill, Oliver Sacks is somebody who really popularized our knowledge of savants. And he wrote about these two twins who were mathematical savants, and yet they were never taught how to do math, and yet they could give these answers to these complex mathematical questions. He also talked about how they could do calendar calculation. That's another very common skill where they can tell you over a span of 40,000 years what day of the week any date would fall on.
I've made a few of those. They ask you what's your birthday and then tell you what day of the week it is. And they can do that for thousands of years.
That's right. That's right. And so a lot of people say, well, how do we know they're not memorizing calendars and that they've got some kind of algorithm they're using? But what's really interesting is that these twins also were able to give prime numbers, and that's a number that can only be divided by itself in one. And they were able to give prime numbers in sequence. They were two twins that would just back and forth give each other these numbers that were 6 digits long. And there really isn't an algorithm for figuring out prime numbers. And Oliver Sacks came back and he gave them he looked up prime numbers, he gave them an 8-digit prime number, and then quickly they started providing 8-digit prime numbers. They ended up going all the way up to 20-digit prime numbers. And it actually, at the time, it was in the 60s, it exceeded their ability to have a computer calculate it to figure out whether or not those were accurate, but they were able to prove the accuracy up to 12 digits. Now, that's really phenomenal when you think about it. And when asked, how do you do this, they say the number just appears in their head. And when you think about it, that is really what people, when they claim to have psychic abilities, that's really what they also say. They also say that the answer just comes to them. They didn't derive it. It's not something they were exposed to. So I started looking at these savant skills as really being something that shows we already have evidence that we can access information and without having any exposure. And that defies the neuroscience model, yet it's accepted by scientists because people can reliably see it. They can reproduce it on
So now you've been looking at children yourself.
Yes.
What kind of savants have you looked at over the years?
Well, I've looked at people who have mathematical abilities. There's something called hyperlexia, and that's when a child can read at a very precocious age. For example, there are children who start reading when they're only 4 months old.
4 months old.
4 months old.
But at 4 months, most children don't know how to speak.
That's right. They learn how to read before they learn how to speak.
I see. And you've studied those?
Yes. I know of a child who, by the time he was 2 years old, could read 7 languages. And
Did you understand them?
Well, that's one of the things that's kind of hard to tell, because when a child's reading at that age, you can't really say how much they comprehend. But just the fact that he's able to read
7 languages.
7 languages. And
how old was this child?
Well, he started by the age of 2. and the child's 5 now. And these languages
Is he still able to do it?
Yes, and these languages are not simple languages. It includes Hebrew, and Arabic, and Greek, and Japanese, as well as English and Russian. I mean, it's really quite remarkable.
Have you studied musical savants?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about those.
Well, the musical savants are able to perform these complex compositions. They can hear like Tchaikovsky or a Mozart piece, and after hearing it, they can play it, but they haven't really been formally trained as musicians.
And now you're studying other children who have these so-called psychic abilities, in that they can see something in their mind's eye when it's not in the range of their visual perception.
That's correct.
So you have a 5-year-old kid, I think, who you're writing some numbers on a whiteboard. He has no access to that visually, but he knows what you're writing.
That's right. That's right. In fact, when I went over to India to evaluate several savants, one of the things that I found was that a common thing that the parents would report was that they experienced telepathy with the child. And it's because I saw that that was so common among them, I started focusing on that. And another reason why I started focusing on that is because it's easier to demonstrate to somebody if they're having telepathy. You can't prove that they didn't have any prior exposure to languages. You can't prove that the mother wasn't teaching them these things, or that they didn't have. That's harder to prove, but if you actually see the mother or some other caregiver looking at numbers, letters, words, pictures, and the child is able to describe them.
Even though it's not in their visual range, the child is seeing what the mother is seeing.
That's right.
Basically.
That's right.
The child is tapping into the consciousness of the mother, basically.
Correct.
So, in science, one of the big problems right now is, where is consciousness? What is consciousness? Is consciousness produced by the brain? There's more and more evidence that suggests that consciousness is actually much more fundamental and not in the physical realm at all. That the physical realm is probably a projection of consciousness, of mind, and mind in turn is a projection of consciousness. But consciousness is basically non-local. It extends everywhere in all of space-time, and may not be in space-time at all. That each of our minds or each of our consciousness is a kind of a branch of a more universal domain of consciousness. When people have these experiences, psychic abilities, able to read or recite these prime numbers in sequence, mathematical skills of other kinds, also being able to see what somebody else is seeing in a different location, that begins to open the window for what we call the non-local realm. Now, of course, in yogic traditions, as we practice the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, for example, Dhyan, Dharana, Samadhi, which is focused awareness, at the same time transcendence and intention, one can tap into these so-called psychic abilities, which are actually dormant non-local potentials. Being able to see something in the distance, hear something, experience its texture, taste, smell, so-called psychic abilities. And because distance in space is also distance in time, they can look into the past or in the future as well. Now, of course, science is very skeptical about these, and experiments to do these experiments to look for non-locality are very difficult to design and unreliable. But the autistic kids with the savant syndromes, they open the window to non-local reality. This is actually the best proof, I think, we have of non-locality. Would you say that?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, as somebody who studied neuroscience and who's been interested in neuropsychiatry, you're obviously leaning towards the idea that consciousness is not in the brain, it localizes through the brain.
Right.
Would you say that?
Yeah, I would say that the brain is really our way of processing consciousness, but not what creates consciousness.
The brain is our way of processing consciousness, not what creates consciousness. So, in your opinion, where is consciousness?
I think it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Okay. You have a book. You have a couple of books, but you showed me a book recently which I found fascinating. Do you want to tell us about that book?
Well, the book is called The ESP Enigma, A Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. And in the book, what I did was, after I had experienced myself some patients who demonstrated to me what looked like telepathy and precognition, I thought, well, I want to know more about this. I want to know, is there any evidence for this? Because scientists, treat it like, well, there's no evidence for it. They always say that there isn't. And then I discovered there's all of this evidence for it. I'm not the first person to have positive results for looking for telepathy. The problem is it's such an extraordinary claim that the scientists say that the data has to be extraordinary. So then I started thinking, okay, how do we find the people who would demonstrate this to the capacity that science is going to demand?
And you have found a lot of kids.
That's right.
Are they all autistic, or some
No.
are normal, so-called normal?
No, they are, yeah, they're not all autistic. One of the things that I did was, as a neuroscientist, a neuropsychiatrist, I asked myself, because the brain is processing information, and so there should be some brain pattern that really is common to these people who have psychic abilities. So one of the states in which people experience these things is when they're sleeping. Another experience...
Which is a non-local state, deep sleep anyway.
And dreaming sleep,
Sure.
people will have telepathic experiences. And then another is meditation seems to have a role in this. And several other conditions, but those are ones that we can just start with those two. And if you look at them, they're ones in which the outer part of the brain, the cortex that we the neuroscientists, think is so, that's where human consciousness is so special, and they make such a big deal out of it. It's actually when you turn down the activity of the cortex that you start to see these abilities. When we're sleeping, it's actually...
You go behind the noise. So
yes, you go behind it, yes, that's right.
You turn down the noise so you can tap into the field where all is connected with everything else.
That's correct, and I think that when a lot of psychics make errors, I think that it's when they're shifting from actually receiving the information in this way that the savants do, to they're making an educated guess, and that's when they're bringing their cortex on board, and so that's, I think, one of the reasons why, because they still have that capacity, one of the reasons why their accuracy isn't that high. Whereas with the autistic children, their brain it's wired differently, and so their cortex is less active. They seem to be processing a lot of information at a deeper level.
Dan, what is your hope now? You're doing research on this. You're collecting case studies. Do you have a lot of children in your files right now that you have gathered this information on?
There's about 13 children who
that you're following right now. So some have psychic abilities, some are mathematical, some are musical. Can you give another example or so?
Another example would be things like knowing things that they hadn't been exposed to. So this isn't a child that I had evaluated, but it's one evaluated by another psychiatrist who was able to draw the periodic table complete with all of the elements in their Latin symbols and their atomic numbers without ever having been exposed to it.
So, in many Eastern traditions, there's something that they call the Akashic field, okay, which would be a non-local field of awareness, which is the record of every human experience that has happened, every human experience that's happening, and every human experience that has yet to happen. Maybe not human, all experience, all life forms. That non-local field is a kind of a matrix of memory, memory and information, and that recycles as what we call, conscious beings, souls. Are you sympathetic to that idea?
Yeah, I am. besides being a neuropsychiatrist, I also did a genetics fellowship and did molecular biology, and so I understand a lot about the genome and epigenetics, which is sort of the controlling system of our genome. And because a lot of people think that that might be where memory is stored, for example, and
I'm tending to think memory is not stored in anything physical.
That's right. And so because of the fact that I've studied both the brain as a neuroscientist and neuropsychiatrist, and I've studied genetics as a geneticist and doing molecular biology, I realized that neither of them could really explain this at all, that there has to be some, like you said, what's been called the Akashic fields, some people call, say the 0-point field, whatever you want to call it, there's some place where information is stored outside of our brain. And
which might be our real home, even our personal memories. That's where we are going right now to fetch. Where is your vocabulary right now, the part of it which you're not using?
That's right. And one of the things that also really promotes this model is that not just autistic people have savant syndrome, but you can acquire it. So there are people who've had an accident in which they've had brain damage. Yeah. And then after that brain damage, they actually have things like perfect memory.
Yes. So I hope this intrigues you. I am going to be supporting Dr. Diane Powell in her research. We want to gather this data. We want to be able to publish it in reliable journals. We want to open the window to our true identity, our non-local nature, because if we are truly non-local beings, then birth and death are just junction points in a continuum that spans eternity. You might say parentheses in eternity. So although this research is fascinating, opening the window to psychic abilities, dormant potentials, non-local potentials, it's also raising the very fundamental question of who are you? Are you a body? Are you a mind? Or are you a consciousness that in fact experiences itself as both body and mind and the universe? Deep questions. People have talked about it in the wisdom traditions, in the perennial philosophies, but so far hypothetically. And then we talk about people who have remembrance of past lives. We talk about people who do remember another lifetime, people who have precognition. But again, you have to take their word. Sometimes you can corroborate that. Have you looked at or the literature that supports evidence that some kids remember other lifetimes?
Yes. There's a lot of research that's actually been done at the University of Virginia.
Ian Stevenson and others.
Correct.
So, which would be the same idea. It's non-locality, really.
Yes.
That people are tapping to, and what's recycling as a being is a matrix of memories, basically.
Yes.
Coming from a bigger matrix or memory bank.
That's correct.
Okay, so you're going to be watching this video. There's a place for you to comment. We're going to be looking for your comments, and I will respond to you, and I'm sure Dr. Powell will too. Let's make this a really serious pursuit, trying to understand the true nature of consciousness through what are called anomalies. It's these anomalies that open the window to a bigger reality, and what we call everyday reality is probably not the real reality. What do you think?
I think you're right.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Powell, for coming by.
Thank you.
Thank you.